Hello and welcome. I'm Ashley Purpura. I'm your host today. I'm an associate professor of religion at Purdue University and the co-editor of the Orthodox Christianity and Contemporary Thought book series with Fordham University Press. I'd like to welcome you all to this installment of Women Scholars of Orthodox Christianity, which is one of the many initiatives of the Orthodox Christian Studies Center at Fordham University. The Fordham Center facilitates, funds, and publishes scholarship on the Orthodox Christian world, broadly understood. To learn more about the center, its initiatives, or publications, please visit the website at www.fordham.edu/orthodoxy. Hopefully you're familiar with it. That's why you found us today. We would also encourage you to follow the center on YouTube, click like on our programming, and share this and any other videos with anyone who might benefit from it. Today, we are joined by Dr. Sarah Bakker Kellogg, who is a sociocultural anthropologist by training and who works at the nexus of theology, gender, and sound studies to examine the resonances of empire and 21st century racial and religious politics in Europe and the Middle East. Since receiving her PhD from UC Santa Cruz in 2013, she has taught in the departments of sociology, anthropology, and women's and gender studies at San Francisco State. So truly interdisciplinary scholar we have with us today. The recipient of numerous awards and fellowships, such as the Social Science Research Council's International Dissertation Research Fellowship, the Charlotte W. Newcomb Doctoral Dissertation Writing Fellowship, and the I'm thinking this is German, but Wenner-Gren Hunt Postdoctoral Fellowship. Sarah has presented widely at international conferences and published articles on secularism and aesthetics, the racialization of ethno-religious identity, and the transnational politics of minority recognition. We focus today on her recently published book, Sonic Icons, Relation, Recognition, and Revival in a Syriac World. And I will just note that if you've registered for our webinar today, you will receive a discount code to purchase the book if you haven't already added it to your collection by email, hopefully shortly after our webinar today. All right, so welcome, Sarah, and to those of you all joining us today for our conversation. For our time today, as usual, we'll begin by having a discussion for half hour or so with our guests, and then we'll open it up to Q&A for our webinar participants. So please put any questions you might have for our guests by clicking the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many as we can before the end. So Sarah, welcome.
Thank you so much, Ashley. I'm so happy to be here.
Well, I'm very excited to talk about your book today, not only because it's in the Fordham series, Orthodox Christianity and Contemporary Thought, but also because it features a part of the Orthodox world that is often underserved in scholarly research. So I'm really excited to hear and have you share a little bit more about your ethnography and also your theoretical intervention in this book with our audience. But before we get to all of that, can you start us off? How did you come to this project? Tell us about yourself as a scholar and what led you to study this community.
Yeah, thank you. So this project is really comes out of many different strands in my life that have converged over the years. And it's really a very personal project that I like to say I started writing it when I was 12 years old, and it was really meeting the Syriac Orthodox community that helped me finish it. This is a project that comes out of my lifelong, um, we'll call it a struggle with feeling like I existed between two Christian worlds, two different branches of Christianity that seem to be saying the same thing, but in practice and in the kinds of demands that they made on people were really, really different and sometimes felt irreconcilable. And I grew up going back and forth between the United States and the Netherlands and kind of struggling with questions of, what is religiosity? What is culture? What is politics? Where are the boundaries between these ideas? And why does one Christian branch of my family say the lines are here, and another Christian branch of my family say the lines are there? And it was really kind of an existential crisis for me from a very young age, and that drove me to anthropology, which It was also a very circuitous route through a stint as a classicist. I studied classics and ended up focusing on um, the the late Roman West and the Christianization of the late Roman West, and the Romanization of Christianity in my undergraduate years. And something I realized after the fact, as I was exploring anthropology, it was that I had this kind of image of the past and the division between something called the West and something called the East that mapped onto modern conceptions of what those words are. And as I was thinking through the issues I wanted to explore as an anthropologist, looking at Europe, looking at the Netherlands, looking at secularism, looking at racism, looking at the position of religious minorities in Western Europe, and especially the rise of anti-Islamic discourses and anti-immigration discourses, the things that were kind of feeling very pressing in adulthood. I suddenly sort of asked myself as I was uh, studying intensive Arabic in preparation to do a project on Moroccan Muslim communities in the Netherlands. My Arabic teacher was an Assyrian Christian from Iraq, and I was like, "What? How have I never heard of this?" And I thought
Right.
about my undergraduate training and the way that this kind of like modern map of the world had shaped what I knew about the past in a way that as I started to think of it, was really problematic. And so I was like, okay, well, I'm going to find out about this Assyrian Christian business. What's going on here? Are there any in the Netherlands? And I literally called up the monastery that ended up being one of my primary field sites. I called up the monastery to just come and visit one day during a preliminary fieldwork stint in my early graduate school years. And they put me on the phone with the newly installed bishop, and he said, "Well, we're having a major event this weekend. Why don't you come down and visit us?" So I went for the weekend just to kind of scope things out and see what was going on and maybe change my project. But within about 15 minutes, they were like, "No, this is what you're doing. This is your PhD project." And I never looked back because it ended up bringing together so many of the threads that I thought had been loose ends my whole life, dealing with questions of family and identity and biculturalism and my own kind of awkward bicultural relationship with Dutch identity, with secularity. And I found as I was getting to know people in the community, in the Syriac Orthodox community, um, even though I don't have a historical connection to Syriac Christianity, I did have a historical connection to navigating Dutch society as a kind of insider outsider. And so we um, that became a really important piece of what kept me. Like there's the story of how I found the project, and then there's the story of how I stayed with the project and where that energy and sense of long-term commitment. So that's kind of the origin story. There's also sort of who I am as a scholar in terms of an ethnographer and I know this is a kind of a multidisciplinary space, so not everyone might know exactly what an ethnographer is and does. So, and it's a really important part of my identity and a very important part of my approach to this work. Being an ethnographer, doing ethnography, or as I like to tell my students, doing ethnographic research in order to produce an ethnography means that you're someone who tells microscopic stories in order to illuminate macroscopic uh, forces and major global processes and problems. And that means that the work that we do is really intensive and immersive, and you spend sort of as long as you can physically stand it in an environment where you really try to see the world from the perspective of the people you're working with. And you're not trying to generalize. You're not trying to make generalizations. You're not trying to extrapolate or make predictions. This is a very interpretive sort of qualitative social science where you're trying to get a sense of the specifics, the specificities and the complexities and the nuances of what is it about this time and this place where these people are navigating and struggling with and living out a certain set of issues that need to be understood in their full context. So microscopic stories that we then contextualize. And so it's long term and it requires a lot of kind of reciprocal vulnerability. You really kind of get in there and you don't pretend to be a neutral observer, fly on the wall. You've got to build relationships with people over time and talk about difficult things and recognize that people react to who you are as a researcher. Um, my identity as a half Dutch, half American, grew up Protestant Christian, young seeming woman at the time, very much shaped who I was going to talk to, who was going to talk to me, the kinds of spaces I could ask, get access to, and the kinds of questions I was able to ask. And so, of course, by necessity, this became um, a project about gender.
So I want to pause here and talk a little bit about how you, I mean, you've already given us some reflections about this, how you positioned yourself as a researcher. So you've given us kind of some reflections on that, and you add them into the book, which I really appreciate, that there's kind of not just a standard, like, here's what my methodology was, but actual ethnographic episodes where you're reflecting on, here's also what happened to me that also speaks to our understanding of the community. For instance, you give us this example of kind of you had more authority being kind of sponsored by the bishop in the monastery setting than any other women. And so just share with us a little bit how you positioned yourself as a researcher in this community, and then how that maybe shaped and reshaped some of those questions. I mean, you've already given us the example of gender, but you also mentioned in the book your language and music lessons, where you're very integrated into the liturgical practice and the things that are important to your participants you're involved with. So share with us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, yes, and so that's I think a good question because it really highlights the heart of ethnography, which is that the source of your evidence as an ethnographer is your embodied experience. It's what you are able to do and participate in. And so the number one most important thing was to attend choir rehearsals with groups of young women in a few of the different parishes and one of the secular cultural organizations and learn to chant, learn to sing the hymns that were part of the repertoire of the Daughters of the Covenant, the what's also called the Gudo, the choirs. And that was something where a lot of the young women I was working with, all of the young women I was working with, were sort of figuring it out as they went along because this is, this practice, as I explained in the book, is a revival. It's something that had sort of kind of faded for many centuries, and in the mid-late 20th century, actually during the Lebanese War, um, kind of of necessity, the women came back to church and started singing because of what was happening with the conflict. And I was a student among students, and that was really kind of how I positioned myself of I am learning with you. I would try to ask people, what are we doing? What does this mean? And the young women I would work with would be like, I don't know. You should ask someone who has like the authoritative knowledge about what we're doing, because there's this very sort of gendered structure of like who gets to speak for the tradition with authority, and and I realized I couldn't take this sort of, I mean, no one should take this sort of extractive model of research of like, okay, give me your data. But I really couldn't do it, even if I'd wanted to in that situation, because um, they were learning, improvising, doing their best with partial information. Um, Different groups would use different strategies, and I would sort of just kind of go listen, keep quiet a lot, not try to aggressively ask too many questions because that would just sort of make them feel self-conscious. And it was more like, all right, let me learn with you and we'll try to figure it out. And um, the music was not in that time and place notated. So you were learning from MP3 recordings. And so we would listen and we would practice, and my throat would hurt because it was a way of singing I wasn't used to. Um, and it was very just kind of scrappy, like um,
Do you have a musical background also? I mean, I know you have a background in learning languages from classics, right? But do you have a music? When I was reading this was kind of a question I had.
So I sang in my school choir and I played flute in the school band, but I've never reached a very proficient level. And I sporadically sing in my own church choir. So
You can carry
I
a tune.
I can carry a tune, I can read music, but I'm not like a an
Sure.
advanced practitioner. I'm very much an enthusiastic amateur. Um,
Mhm.
and so I which kind of put me at the level of the like the average 12-year-old girl in the
Okay,
community.
sure. Yeah.
Because, when you grow up immersed in that musical environment, you learn it at this very embodied level, the melodies and the rhythms, and it becomes a very intuitive, visceral kind of knowledge rather than a I know how to read music kind of knowledge. And so I think that positioned me to kind of function at the level of the young women who were learning how to participate in these choirs. And then in terms of the language piece, oh, and just to not drop your question about the kind of authority weirdly
Oh,
bestowed upon me by the bishop. I was a researcher, and so I kind of counted as a learned person. That was very much in the space of the monastery when the bishop was around. Um, if I would leave the monastery, I was a little bit more on my own,
right.
left to my own devices. And so the method there was just like make friends, have coffee, spend afternoons with the family and help make dinner and do domestic chores.
I think that comes through so beautifully in the book because you have these few kind of episodes that you recount, like sitting in a cafe talking, and then the issue of like race and ethnicity comes up, and there's kind of a code switching that happens among you and your participant of, well, when the waiter comes over, we're going to engage in this, these are not topics that we're going to talk about, or we're not going to use our language in front of these kind of secular Dutch folks who would see us as outsiders. So I found that type of kind of just integrating yourself into the daily life still provides us with a lot of information and kind of really interesting touch points in the book.
Right, right. And I think it for me, there were moments where I was like, oh, I wish I had this kind of like authoritative presence where you know, seniors would tell me all the
Mhm.
authoritative knowledge and but I think that in some ways my I mean I think of it as at the time I was experiencing it as oh my inadequacy as a researcher, but in over time I was like no, this is uh friendship as method. Those kind of conversations you have on a long walk through a park where you're getting into really difficult terrain about people's emotional lives and navigating expectations from parents and the outside the Dutch context where you're supposed to be a certain way and behave a certain way and present yourself as a certain kind of subject. And that feels like such a betrayal of your parents and your grandparents. And it's really painful and really hard to talk about. And so being someone that you can have that kind of painful, confusing conversation with, I think was probably my most important method. Just,
That mutual kind of vulnerability,
yeah,
allowed them to share that,
yeah.
those
And
moments.
to say that like I understand, I have this kind of I mean I don't understand everything, but I have
Right.
some points of connection to understand the how confusing it is to navigate these issues. And just listen. Um,
Well, let's talk for a minute. I mean, you mentioned the women's choirs, trying to sing along with them, and then also your methodology. Now, the title for this book, Sonic Icons, to somebody that thinks of icons in a particularly either living way, as in saints, or as in, I've got one behind me, like a visual, a mural on a wall, in this kind of, yeah, visual, kind of optic way. What do you mean by sonic icons? It's a theme that you pick up in almost every chapter. Can you explain that for maybe those of us who haven't read the book yet, but will certainly do after this webinar? And and why is the liturgy and hymn singing, why are these women's choirs so central to preserving the Syriac Orthodox identity among the community? You have a quote on page 94, and I don't want to read your own book to you, so I'll just read it briefly for the sake of our participants to give a sense of kind of your analysis here. But you say the chant, like the visual icon, implodes space and time by virtue of the hypostatic union within the incarnation, which enables congregations, as well as the deacons and cantors leading them in prayer, to participate in salvation by revoicing their saintly and biblical precursors. I mean, just mic drop, because you're doing such theological and theoretical heavy lifting in analyzing a seemingly kind of simple, not simple, but right, so, common to this community. People, everyone is, the women that go to church are trying to engage in these vocal practices. So anyway, I gave you a lot there. Take it as you will. Maybe start
yes.
with the sonic icons part and then tell us a little bit more about these choirs,
Yeah.
and why that the singing and the liturgy is so central to their navigating their identity and sense of self in this different place.
Yeah. So I think that the first thing that I think about when I think about a sonic icon is I remember something Bell Hooks once wrote about the word love, which is that it is not a noun, it is a verb. It's something you do. It's an action, and it's a set of actions, and it's a relationship. So it's a relational verb. That's how I think about an icon. Um, it can be an image, but it doesn't have to be an image. It is a material form that enables a set of relational practices. Um, and that material form can be sound, it can be a painting, it can probably be any number of things I haven't thought about yet. What is really important and what becomes clear when you understand incarnational theology and really grapple with theology as a source of theorizing. Theology, I think, is just as good as secular theory for, I mean, it's the same thing. It's all a theory is an explanation. The best explanation available to fit the facts as we know them so far. And so for me, incarnational theology, understanding the story of the birth, life, and death of Christ, is a story of growth and vitality and change and creating relationships. And in that, in the story of the incarnation, um, we receive the first icon, um, the creation of a relation between the human and the divine. Um, and the relation is not a connecting of parts that are separate. It's an unveiling of the relationality of identity that was already there.
And
And theology, like it's really important to read theology carefully and think about theology carefully, and also understand that theology doesn't have to be written down to be theology. You can theorize theologically through embodiment, through practice, practical theology. It's a thing. And so I see what the women are doing, what the whole community is doing is practical theology. And the icon is the sonic icon is through the voice, creating, recreating, sustaining the relational identity of the human in relation to the divine and the human in relation to all the other members of the body of,
re-imaging, but vocally here
yes,
through kind of an
yeah,
oral. That's
yes. And it's not a metaphor.
right.
That's
No, it's participative. I love that you bring that out.
Yeah, because the way sound works, when you grow up in a tradition, you grow up in this soundscape. Sound shapes our subjectivity. When you grow up immersed in a world that looks and sounds and feels a way, it shapes who you are at a very profound level. And you don't need to be well versed in like Foucauldian critical theory to get that, to think about how our bodies, our ears, our minds, our hearts are trained by the sensory environment. And so when you grow up, and this is a quotation from one of the young men I talked to who led one of the who was involved in kind of on the men's side of the deaconate. He would say when you grow up in this environment, when you grow up singing in church, you cannot help but be a musician. You
it's
embody it because you're immersed in it. And so the sonic icon just kind of names that relationship, um, and that sensory practice of creating and recreating identity and recognizing that at the heart of the tradition is reproduction. Every icon is a reproduction of something that came before. And it's in that merging of the human and the divine, or that meeting of the human and divine, that relationship between the human and divine, it happens in real time. It happens in history. This is a reading of history incarnationally. Um, and so growth, change, life, death, birth, rebirth, like that's history. That's the history of violence, migration, loss, grief, um, joy, recovery, revival. You can hear all of that in the sound of the chant. And that's why there are these schools of chant. Um, and people aren't like, oh, your school of chant is wrong. The different schools of chant are all important expressions of the incarnation.
It did seem, I mean, at least you did talk a little bit about the different schools coming from different areas, coming out of different monasteries. So are people aware of like, this is mine? Because you talk about a little bit about, I think it was a cultural center group came and sang, and the people in your community were like, no, 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 that's not, like, we can't even register quite that that's the same thing. It's different. It's not how we do it, right? It's a difference. So how are those differences kind of navigated a little bit?
Right. Well, it's important to distinguish um, that moment of rejection of that secular cultural choir. It was not because people felt what were singing and how they were singing was wrong.
Oh, okay, right.
It was like my some of some of my closest friends were like, they're beautiful singers. And
Right,
I really respect the tradition, the school of Urfa through via Aleppo. Like that's a the school of Edessa.
right.
Uh, respect it immensely. The problem is what they're calling it and where they're performing it, because it's tying into a different set of issues that came up a lot. And that I almost want to bracket this
Ethnic
conversation,
kind of identity.
right? Because it starts
Yeah,
to get into, is this Assyrian ethnic
right,
folklore,
right.
or is this, an essential kind of central sacred practice that happens within the church? And then what does that mean for how we explain to outsiders about who we are and what we're doing? And that's where the recognition piece comes in. But when we're kind of focusing on the icon, what's happening in church also resonates outside of church. And that's what I think one of the big things I'm trying to show as well is that, I had to let go of my Western Christian definition of like what liturgy is and where the boundaries of liturgy are. For these women, liturgy is your whole lifespan. It is not bounded by church, because the drama of salvation, this is cosmic, this is every aspect of our lives. Um, and when I sing in the choir, this is, and they would disagree with each other. There would be debates like, can I keep singing after I'm married, or do I move to a different position? Like, there are all sorts of vital questions. And I think that's one of the key things as well, and why I really wanted to center this idea of reproduction, sonic iconicity. It's relational and it's reproductive because it's alive. It's vital. You're constantly reproducing and reproducing and reproducing. And so there's instability there, and there's uncertainty there, and there's
Each
what do I
too, but
keep?
we can still kind of harken back to the archetype, right?
Right,
And
right. We
so I
keep that
appreciate it.
thread,
Yeah,
but in that process of reproduction, because again, the incarnation was vital and alive and
yeah.
changed over time. Um, and so it's sort of turtles all the way down. Um, it's reproduction all the way down. And I think that that's rooted in an understanding of the incarnation as the vital kind of creation and recreation of relationality.
So that, I mean, that kind of leads to my other question, which is, can you give us some examples of how, I mean, several chapters focus on how your participants understand their identity. And some of it's through this liturgical practice, some of it's in learning and make sure they're using Syriac as a language. But also in relation to things like kinship, family. So we have religion and culture, and race even comes up, language, migration. So maybe can you summarize? Oh, ultimately, is there a way to summarize kind of the findings, or are they all particular to kind of how different individuals understand and articulate their identity, and how it's understood by others, in particular, like the Dutch broader society, how they, I mean, you have some really both troubling and interesting examples of, being mischaracterized or misidentified as like, oh, you're Moroccan, or oh, you're from this part of wherever, because without getting to know the particularities. So, yeah, just explain to us a little bit more about the identity, how they preserve it. Um, and then we also had, you have some beautiful kind of reflections about Christians in this context being Christian, and that being like an immovable part of your identity, even if you no longer believe in God, but because you're Syriac, you're Christian, right? It's just somehow in your identity, opposed to the maybe more Dutch kind of Calvinist concept of like you become a Christian. And so the community's reaction, let's say, to the scholar who converts into their community navigates this a little bit. I mean, he was an expert in Syriac literature and religious texts, so it was kind of, accepted. But yeah, if you could just speak to that, how is that identity kind of understood, maintained, navigated?
Yeah. Yeah. So that is a really crucial and difficult question that I think I grapple with by going back to the work of Mikhail Bakhtin
Mm.
and the notion of dialogism and the idea that for all of us everywhere, identity is the kind of constant outcome of our interaction with others. Other voices resound within us and influence our sense of ourselves. And so polyvocality, the multiple voices, um, there's no clear cut inside and outside. And this is true for everyone, everywhere. And this is kind of this is one of the dimensions of reproduction. When you are raising a child and they're learning language from you and they're learning to see themselves through your eyes. This goes for individuals, this goes for communities, this goes for nations, this goes for whole worlds. And so there's this dialogical encounter among voices, and our sense of ourselves as people, who we are, what our identity is constantly in flux. And we see this in the texts of the Syriac fathers 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 1,800 years ago, um, and not just in the Syriac fathers. This is just kind of one of the facts of life. Um, and so what you are encountering, um, when you are migrating from Turkey to Western Europe in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, um, is a specific set of voices that say, this is what it means to be an ethnic minority. This is what it means to be a racial minority. And in one context, for parents and grandparents who hear that and their sense of self is formed in that environment, and then their children and grandchildren whose sense of self is formed in a Dutch environment where they've got Dutch and European secularist conceptions of like, this is what religion is, this is what ethnicity is, but then their grandparents are like, well, ethno-religion, that you can't hyphenate that. This is a tight-knit community based on a language and a set of ethical precepts about how to be a family, how to take care of each other as a village. Village identity is so essential. And so young people growing up with these voices, coming from different places, incorporating them into their sense of themselves and saying, this is an existential crisis. Um, and the piece that I kind of really try to highlight is that it's it's kind of modern secularity that really makes it a crisis. Because there are lots of times and places in history where it's not a problematic proposition to understand yourself in um, for a religious identity to be an ethnic identity and a political identity. There are it doesn't get privatized in that way. It doesn't get individualized in that way. And if you talk to scholars working on Armenian Christianity and other minoritized communities from throughout the Middle East and also globally, like this is actually not that weird. Like this is
Yeah,
not
it's
that
probably more
uncommon.
common.
It's in a way it's really the kind of like high modernist
Mhm.
secularist, somehow we separate what we believe from who we are and who raised us. Like that's a fairly recent and not super plausible invention anyway. That doesn't quite work um, for a lot of people. And so I think that's a big piece of what I'm trying to do is just like, I would be talking to these young women who would just be like, we're so weird. I feel so weird. And I'm like, you're not weird. You're being made to feel weird by
Right.
a particular tradition that has been normalized and universalized through the language of like secular modernity. But what if it's secular modernity that's weird?
Let's go with that. It's great. I mean, you give us so much insight kind of theoretically too, but maybe you could just thinking of ethnography as like storytelling. Can you give us, maybe share with us just one or two examples or three or four? I mean, I'm mindful of time. So if we do have from our participants, if anyone wants to go ahead and start putting your questions into the chat, into the Q&A, that would be great to kind of, we'll look forward to that. But maybe just share with us a couple stories from your research that either surprised you or challenged you to kind of reshape those questions or what you thought you were going to find, and then, oh, it's something completely different. So,
Yes. Absolutely. I would say the big one, the first one that really forced me to confront my own implicit Calvinism that I thought I had exercised, but apparently had not.
but again, there's that religious identity being very sticky, even
Yeah,
if it is perceived to be a
very
choice.
deep in my psyche. When I first started to get to know the choirs, and I realized many of the young women I worked with didn't understand the meaning of what they were singing. They didn't, they maybe had a really basic grasp of classical Syriac. They might have been speaking Turoyo, um, the modern language at home, which has some, relationship with the classical Syriac, but isn't necessarily like immediately
Same.
intelligible. Um, for some people, that was an issue of like, we want to understand what we're singing. But for a lot of people, that wasn't an issue. Like, that's not what they were there for. They weren't there to understand what they were singing in a kind of intellectual way. And in my early days of graduate school work, I was like, what? How is that possible? And it was actually um, one of my advisors, Don Brennis, who's a well-known sound studies scholar, who was like, why would that matter? Like, doesn't that just say more about you than about them? And
Yes.
I had to really think about that and where that came from in my own sense of, doesn't everyone want to understand what they're saying? No, that's not if that's not the main point. The
Right.
main point is for many people all this other stuff. It's about, what the sound does, not what the sound means.
Yeah.
And for some people, what the sound means is important,
Right.
and they're willing to change what the sound does. But that's because they have a specific kind of relationship to the sort of Western Christian and kind of secular frameworks that they're forced to engage with. And other people are finding ways to integrate them. We don't want to lose this sense of the importance of, sound. There's an ontological way of thinking about sound in a Calvinist kind of model. It's like you can disembed it from its social context. That's like we think we can do that. In a Syriac sort of ontological model, you can't disembed the sound from its social context and its social history and its social relationships because that is what it is. And this is actually pretty consonant with um, musical metaphysics throughout the Middle East, Turkish music, Arabic music. Like you learn um, from a master with a
Right.
lineage, and that entails an ethical cultivation. So there's a larger musical metaphysical system that this participates in. Um, And young women sort of have to decide like what's their relationship to those different forces and voices and frameworks, and what are they going to keep and what are they going to let go. Um, and so there's a lot to navigate. I feel like I might have gotten off your your initial question.
You bring us to, I mean, you give us some, good examples, but also it raises other points that you point out in the book about like the difference of what you were expecting that, for instance, the high notes or the high sounds were mournful. And they're like, why would you sing that way? It's a festival, it's a festive kind of
Yeah.
hymn. We need to sing with low tones or your inability, apparently, in their mind, to even grasp those kind of microtones in your own singing because your ear is attuned maybe to more Western music. So if again, you're not raised in that type of musical
Yeah.
soundscape, it's very
Yes.
challenging. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that is a very good example of when I got in trouble with my teacher because my register dropped when I was
Right.
singing a song that was supposed or no, my register went up.
Right.
And so I
Right.
sounded sad. And I was like, I don't sound sad. What are you talking about? But it is precisely that sensory training from an aesthetic world and a musical metaphysics where certain sounds carry certain feelings um, that are not universally translated, which is not how people like to talk about music. We like to talk about music as like the universal language, but actually,
It's very culturally contingent, right?
yeah.
It has yeah, distinctions. Well, maybe for your second example, or second story, can you share with us something in particular about like how gender and authority work in this community? Because I mean, you've talked about kind of the women were those you're most closely and maybe more regularly engaged with, even though you were connected to the bishop and to deacons and these other members of the community. But how did how did the women see if they didn't have this authority to interpret or speak for kind of the church, but they seem to have, at least from your accounts, to have a lot of authority in preserving and maintaining and sustaining the community network and language. So can you share with us a little bit, maybe an example from your field work about kind of how the women navigate that role or their authority in the
Yeah.
community.
Yeah. I mean, I think that it's it's a little complicated because I think we have to complicate the word authority itself,
Oh, sure. Yeah.
um, and kind of recognize different modes of authority and different domains of authority. And there's th there's kind of a broader insight among anthropologists of gender, gender scholars in general, that some gender complementarian systems are hierarchical and some gender complementarian systems are egalitarian. And there's this idea that like your you know, oh, in some systems, a woman's domain may be very circumscribed around caretaking, family, motherhood, and any kind of profession that sort of fits in with that very idealized feminine function. But you get to be master of that domain.
Right, right.
And there's a lot we can say about that. But here we're in a setting where there are a lot of competing discourses about gender. And Western Europe is not as gender egalitarian as it would like to present itself as. And
Sure.
certainly the Netherlands isn't. Um, and so there's talk and there's practice and there's how did my parents do it? How did my grandparents do it? How are people talking? How are my friends doing it? How are people talking about this at school? Um, and so young women have a lot of choices to make, if they even feel like they have choices to make. There is a strong sense of I had a lot of people talk to me about the struggles they had with feeling kind of constantly scrutinized by everyone, by parents, by extended family, by neighbors, and also by the Dutch state and by Dutch people who are like, are you modern enough? Are you emancipated enough? And they're like, but I'm trying to save my tradition.
Your whole yeah.
I'm trying to save Syriac Christianity from disappearing off the face of the earth, and all you think about is like, am I speaking Dutch well enough? And so there's this really interesting set of choices about what am I going to prioritize in the time available to me. Some women say classical Syriac. I am going to work on learning classical Syriac with my children. We're going to spend 15 minutes a day practicing classical Syriac, and I am going to participate in the Gudo to be a good example to my children and to like bring my child with me. Sister, cousin, neighbor, friend might say, no, that's not my priority. My priority is um, I'm married. I have kids. I do not have time for the choir anymore. Anyway, it's supposed to be for virgins historically, so why would I do that? Um, that's a little contentious, but reasonable people disagree. Um, I'm going to focus on the version of Aramaic that matters most to me, which is Turoyo, the the spoken language of Turabdin, the region in southeast Turkey, where many people in this corner of the Syriac world come from, because that is the language of the home, that is the language of family relationships, that is our history, that is our regional identity, that is our village identity, and that is the heart of being Syriac Orthodox for me and my family.
That's this great example in the book about the social work or the school contacts the parents. It's like your child doesn't speak Dutch well enough and is just shocked when they realize the parents speak Dutch perfectly.
Mhm.
It's they making a conscious choice to speak a different language to preserve it in the home. And so I mean that was just kind of I think that gets to that dynamic of those
Yeah.
choices, right, that have to be
Yeah.
made in this kind
Yeah.
of gender negotiation.
A gender negotiation that's also a geopolitical negotiation because they're very, that particular mother was very clear of like, what country am I going to send my child to for them to make sure they learn Toroyo?
Right,
Nowhere. It's me or this language goes extinct.
right.
So there's an awareness of like the layers of political context that influence these decisions. And if there were a different political situation, that might be a different choice for that particular mother.
Well, I want to make sure we get time here in our last, 6 or 7 minutes for the Q&A. So we do have a question based on what you learned about the inseparability of ethnicity, race, and faith. What are your thoughts about the applicability of these lessons to Orthodox converts who are attending ethnic Orthodox parishes in the United States? So I definitely relate to this question. Growing up in a Greek Orthodox parish at one time, not being Greek, again, that being just kind of not understandable to some of my kind of co-religious
Mhm.
participants. Why are you at this church? You're not Greek. I'm Orthodox, but you're not Greek, right?
Right.
In that
Right.
particular setting. So I sympathize with this question that are
Yeah, I mean that is a really, I think, I really appreciate that question because it helps me bring it back to the something I didn't get to respond to, which is that tension between
yeah.
being Christian and becoming Christian. Um, what I have learned is that the idea of ethnicity as the thing you inherit by blood is as constructed as the idea that religion is the thing you choose in your brain.
Right.
Um,
Right.
the point is, there is a complex relational identity that is embedded in a social world that entails a lot of learning and a lot of cultivating relationships. And so I would say, and the history of Orthodoxy is the history of practices creating relationships. And so I think that if I were to kind of put my personal editorializing spin on this a little bit, I would say coming in with a sense of respect and desire to learn about the cultural history and the language, understanding that that has historically been integral to the expression of that tradition. And that doesn't mean that has to be like fixed in amber for all time and that it must be the way it was in the 14th century from now until the end times, but understanding that the incarnational theological approach here is that history matters and our relationship with that history matters. And there's an ethical way to relate to that history, and there's an unethical way to relate to that history. And an unethical way to relate to that history is to say it doesn't matter, let's erase it all and let's pretend it never happened. And so being a student, being willing to be a student, being willing to listen and learn and understand that like liturgy and language take a long time to learn. Like learning Syriac is hard. Um, but it's also not just hard for converts, it's hard for people who grew up in the tradition as well. Because, I think one of the great mistakes of our time is this idea that tradition and modernity are opposites. There's this false binary that in the past, everything was simple and everyone agreed. And it's only with the modern in modern life where something at some point ruptured and now everybody disagrees and everything is a problem because we encounter difference. I think that is a catastrophic lie about history and about the present. Everybody has always been disagreeing about everything from the beginning. That is why the tradition is vital. The tradition is alive and is full of acts of reproduction and exterior voices becoming part of the interior voice. It was always dynamic. It was always a negotiation. People were always marrying in. People were always like those borders and boundaries were never actually as porous as imporous as anyone wanted to say they were. So it's I think it just as approaching that with a sense of openness to the ethical task at hand. To enter into this tradition is to enter into a centuries long disagreement about what the tradition is and constantly checking in with yourself about like, is this something I'm bringing with me or is this something I'm discovering? What are my biases? What are my preconceptions? If I were a convert who was like, wait, you don't understand the meaning of the Syriac you're singing? Well, we got to fix that, guys. Like, that would not be a very ethical way for me to approach my conversion into Syriac Orthodoxy. It would be, I should learn Syriac and I should try to understand where this is all coming from. I hope that helps address somewhat. I know it's a difficult, complicated issue, but that's kind of what I got at this
I
point.
love that you're having us just kind of sit in that dynamic that, that it's complicated and it's always been complicated, but also attending to that incarnational, very much embodiedness of tradition, that it's not just like a faith that's in our brain that we're passing down, but it also comes with those both vocal acts, those physical acts, that food, whatever, right? Those kinship ties. It's ingrained in a lot of spaces that are beyond the bounds of the church wall. So I appreciate that you've give us some time to think about that. Well, I know we still have a few questions, but we're about at the end here of our time. Sarah, do you want to give us any final thoughts, maybe like one final takeaway or pitch for your book? Clearly, I'm a fan, but you give us in the book so much, both theoretically in terms of the ethnography, reflections on gender and power and migration and culture and identity and liturgy and theology and church history. There's a lot. I mean, the book is only like 200 some odd pages, and there's so much. So if you could give us kind of one takeaway that doesn't sum up the whole book, but just leaves us with something as we end our session today.
Yeah, I think that idea of the vitality of tradition, and it's always been a conversation. Tradition, Patriarch Michael was having having not too dissimilar fights back in the
Yeah.
day. There was no sort of magical moment in the past where everything was simple. Um, Everything was always complicated, and that reading of the past, I think, is warranted by what we understand from the incarnation. And so there is a lot of space for beauty and the beauty of openness and negotiation and conversation, and practice, like the relational, to really center the idea that this is a relational practice, creating kinship. We didn't really talk about kinship that much, but kinship as, kinship with each other, kinship with the divine, kinship as that irreducible relationship can be made. We don't have to surrender that language to the kind of secular, racist, like, it's kinship isn't just blood. And that's what Syriac tradition teaches us. Kinship, real kinship, is spiritual kinship.
What a great way to end. Thank you so much for joining us, Sarah. And thank you all to our webinar participants who have also joined us. As always, you'll be able to view this recording on our website or on the YouTube page, excuse me, along with previous webinars. And we look forward to bringing you another episode in this series on April 11th at 2 p.m. Eastern. We'll have the Covenant's Veil discussing Ethiopian Orthodoxy with Alexandra Selassie and Token. So I look forward to hopefully seeing more of you again at that time. Thank you again, Sarah, so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. It's been an absolute joy.